So yesterday, Lenny Bound sent me a message asking about Frank Jackson, um, a thought experiment that he came up with in I think it was in his book Epiphenomenal, Qualia in 1982. Unless he came up with it in a paper before that, I'm not sure. But the argument is basically that there's a neuroscientist who's trapped in a room that's completely black and white. There's no color, nothing containing color in the room, and she is educated in the full scope of an understanding of neuroscience. So she knows the portion of the visual cortex that is related to color vision. She knows the whole brain. She knows the rods and cones and the retina and the optic nerve, and she's completely as well versed as one could be today about the nature of the brain and the nature of the physical world and so forth. And then the experiment comes, or Frank Jackson's question is, if she were to be removed from this room and were able to see color for the first time, would she learn something new? Would there anything be added to her knowledge of reality? Um, Frank Jackson said in 1982, at least, yes. But it appears that in a newer book in 2003 called Mind and Illusion, he changed his mind. And I'll read what Lenny sent me about what he says in that book. Quote, color experience presents to us as if it were the acquisition of information about highly salient, more or less intrinsic features of our surroundings. But there are no physical features fitting this characterization. In consequence, color experience presents itself to us as if it were information about certain non-physical features. Indeed, we may want to go so far as to say that sensing red misrepresents how things are. If this is right, we should say that nothing is red, for nothing would be as our experience of red represents things as being. We should be eliminativists about red and about color in general. A more moderate position is that although our experience of color contains a substantial degree of misrepresentation, the misrepresentation that leads dualists astray, there are complex physical properties out there that stand in relations near enough to those captured by the color solid for us to be able to identify them with the various colors. So let's leave that moderate position aside for the moment, because I think it's qualifying the real position that he has and not really adding much to it, because I think he is taking the more extreme eliminativist position by saying that color does not tell us or add anything to the world, and in fact it is a misrepresentation of the world. Um, or at least it contains a substantial degree of misrepresentation. Um, I guess the moderation at the end is him adding, the more moderate position is him adding the fact that we can be kind of right about what the objective thing is. There is something like the wavelength of light, which is related to a color, even though I think Jackson would know that the same wavelength of light, which is measured by some objective piece of technological machinery, does not always match to the same experience color. So what usually appears as green can appear red, for those that just happen to have a slightly different array of rods and cones in their eyes, but also if the lighting is different, if you've got different frequencies of light reflecting off the surface, which is apparently colored in a particular way. If you have white light or sunlight, you'll see colors in a certain fashion, but with a different frequency of light reflecting off of the surface, the color of what you thought was intrinsic to that surface itself or that thing itself actually shifts because its environment has shifted, or the light which allows it to be seen has changed. So there isn't really any objective correlation between color as qualia and the physical world as a collection of objects which have mass and sometimes motion, and exist at some particular slice or finite moment in time. or at least that's what we talk about when we say the physical world, right? And Lenny asked me if I would prefer the old Jackson's position, the Jackson who supported the notion of qualia as irreducible to the physiological brain. And while I think Jackson certainly recognizes something important there, I wouldn't agree that we should be speaking of that important recognition in terms of qualia. I think the recognition is that subjective experience or consciousness is somehow a necessary component of reality. And when science talks about nature as though it were only objective, only a collection of objects, of inert things which obey laws and can be measured and predicted and so forth, then science is leaving out the very ability that scientists have to know that knowledge of the objective world. Science is an act of knowing, and so it always includes the subject. Now, when we get really abstract, we start dividing our experience up into primary and secondary qualities, or substance and attribute or quality, or subject and predicate, like in our grammar. And these divisions between a thing and what the thing is like, or what kind of attributes it has, aren't actual distinctions in reality. In our experience, I mean, this is where I think Jackson or your standard physicalism or materialism or reductivism goes wrong. It assumes that the physical world is primary, that it comes first, and that somehow if this thing, consciousness or process consciousness or experience of consciousness exists, we can't really talk about it in science because it's too spooky, right? Because you can't do science without admitting it exists. So an eliminativist, I think, is trying to hold down an impossible position, because to know about nature as though it were a collection of objects, you already have to have assumed that you are conscious enough to know it. So you can't eliminate consciousness if you want to keep science or knowing. So this is the issue. Now, what does it mean if we accept that color is a fundamental property of reality itself? Not just color, but all of our experience. Emotion is a fundamental property of reality itself. I mean, to really say this right, we just have to admit that reality is a subject and an object. Or it has a subjective and an objective pole. It has an outside and an inside. A without, a surface, and a within, an interior. And, you know, that's summing up everything I'm saying in my videos, I think, for the past year and a half. That's all I've been saying, and I think the more I say it, the more I keep repeating myself. Maybe I should change it up, but I think it was a response, though, to your question, Lenny, hopefully, and or at least let you know what I'm thinking about this particular issue at this particular moment, and maybe you'll find it interesting, maybe you won't, but feel free to post a video response, or send me a text message, whichever you prefer. So thanks for the message, and take it easy.